So, again, we look at the time frame. We begin the time frame for Daniel chapter 4. The title of, before I jump into that, for this chapter, of course, is God's intolerance to sin in the midst of his sovereignty. So, his intolerance to sin and his mercy in the midst of his sovereignty. The time frame now in between chapter 3 or chapter 2 and 4 is, again, about the middle years of Daniel's life. When we read Daniel's life, we assume that his life is filled with these miracles. Oftentimes when we look at Scripture or we look at these characters within the Old Testament, especially in the Old Testament, also in the New when we're looking at Acts and looking at the testimonies of the apostles, we almost kind of get a heroic ideal, don't we? We think about David, think about Samson, we think about Daniel. Like, man, these guys were just titans of the faith, right? They were so beyond what we can consider to be faithfulness, so beyond the abilities that the Lord gave them to do. But in reality, if we look at that connecting to the time frame of the 70 years of Daniel's life under pagan empires, we really only see 9 specific events that Daniel records that happened in his lifetime of 70 years in this Babylonian empire. So you're thinking one of these events occurred, on an average of almost every 8 years. So it kind of makes you think about that, doesn't it? It kind of sets the perspective in the right way of like, these guys were still just men like we were. And it makes that connection of not just this guy was a titan of the faith where I can never attain to that, but better to be understood as here's a man who is constant in his faith. He is in the good seasons and the bad seasons, in the seasons of excitement, in the seasons of maybe drudgery and just kind of, lack of a better term, just nothing really happening. He remains faithful, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He remains faithful. And so the 70 years of Daniel's life, what I would rather focus on, instead of these amazing, exciting events, which do happen in a historical record, is to realize that as far as his character goes, here's a man who is constant in his faith, and that's a good application for us. But back to the time frame, it's happening around the middle years of Daniel's life. This account probably occurred during the 30th year reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So that would mean Daniel would be around 40, 45 years old, okay? If we put the context of him being removed from the invasion of Jerusalem into Babylon, if we put his age about maybe 15 or 16 years old. So if that's the case, if Daniel is about 40 to 48 years old, that means that there's a gap of time between chapter 3 and chapter 4 of about 20 to 25 years, okay? 20 to 25 years have passed between chapter 3 and 4. So this is what we're going to discover in chapter 4. Has anybody read, not that I've asked you guys to do this, but anybody read ahead and read chapter 4 yet? No? Okay. So that's okay. So what we're going to discover then is the narrative of Nebuchadnezzar as the focus. What's interesting about chapter 4 is that this is not necessarily Daniel writing from his perspective at all, but you look at verse 1. Let's just take a look at verse 1 real quick before we jump in there. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. This is, in fact, Nebuchadnezzar from a first-person perspective writing. He's, in fact, writing this chapter, and Daniel is recording it in his historical record or in his prophetic book. So we discover a narrative again of Nebuchadnezzar as the focus. This is in Nebuchadnezzar's words. Again, we remember what language it's written in. Anybody know? Aramaic. That's right. It's written in Aramaic all the way to the end of chapter 7. So the narrative is Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, we see this as a mode of a testimonial. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking out himself about what the Lord has done in his life that has really changed his character, changed who he is as a man, changed his identity. And so I have two quotes for you guys that I want you kind of to understand about the compromise of sin and God's intolerance to sin because of that. The first one is from Jeremy Taylor, who was a man of God. I believe he was a Puritan, an English Puritan that lived around 1613 to 1667. If you'd like, you don't have to write these quotes down. I can email them to you if you're interested in them. But here's the quote from Jeremy Taylor about sin, where he says this: "A man is first startled by sin, then it becomes pleasing, then easy, then delightful, then frequent, then habitual, then confirmed. The man becomes impenitent," meaning he's not sorry, "then obstinate, then he is damned." So it kind of talks about the process of compromise, moving from a startling of sin then to ultimate damnation as the trickle-down effect in his life from small sins to greater sins. And then the next one is from Blaise Pascal, who was just a wonderful thinker of the 1600s. From 1623 to 1662, Blaise Pascal. He has his book on the Pensies is a wonderful book to read, although a bit thought-heavy. He says this: "There are only two kinds of men, the righteous who believe themselves sinners, and the rest who are sinners who believe themselves to be righteous." So the question we ask ourselves is, which one are we? Are we sinners who believe ourselves to be righteous, or are we righteous who believe to be sinners? So that's the question we're going to ask ourselves, and ultimately look at that as we jump into the chapter 4 in Daniel. So Daniel 4, verses 1 through 3. Since we have a smaller group, let's have everybody read this time. So we'll just start going down the row. Let's read verses 1 through 3.
Me?
Yep,
Yeah.
go for it.
Okay. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His kingdom endures from generation to generation.
Okay, here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he's writing a testimonial, and look how amazing what he's saying here. Look at the wonderful, actually worshipful words that he's using, not for pagan gods, not for pagan deities, but he's using them for our God, for Daniel's God. "Peace be multiplied to you. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation." So this is an amazing account from a seemingly pagan emperor. It's interesting that in the Masoretic text, which was then translated into the Latin Vulgate, that this chapter presented is not only a letter just to Daniel, but it's understood that this was a letter that was to be given to all the nations. This is something that Nebuchadnezzar wanted every person under his empire to know what happened to him. It was a public decree among all the peoples of Babylon and throughout the entire empire. So seemingly Nebuchadnezzar wants all to know what he has gone through, and what the Lord has done in his life. And this is why we see kind of the action word there in verse 2. Do you see that? Where it says, "It has seemed good to me." It has seemed good to me. What is Nebuchadnezzar writing there in the Aramaic? It seemed good to me. We have that in our translation, but the literal interpretation of this, the little interpretation of "it seemed good to me," is in fact how I saw it beautiful. I saw it beautiful to write these words. How does that work? How does a pagan man who follows all of these pagan deities then has this encounter with God that is really, as we'll look in the chapter, quite negative in his life? It's not a benefit, it's not a blessing, at least in the practical. A man that literally goes, I'm giving you a preview of what we're going to be looking at in the chapter, but a man who literally goes insane. He goes crazy for 7 years, to the point that he cannot lead his kingdom, he cannot lead his empire, and he's basically just kind of watched and made sure that he doesn't hurt himself for 7 years in his insanity, and then he comes out of it in a way that is humbling to the point that he needs to give this testimony to all people. He sees that as being something beautiful. It seemed good to me. I saw it to be beautiful to relate this to you guys about what the Lord has done for me. I think that's a powerful thing for us to understand. He wants us to know what he has gone through and what the Lord has done in his life. And so he says these things. He says this in a worshipful manner. Verse 3, I saw how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. Two things that he wants to make them aware of, signs and wonders. Do you guys know what a sign is, specifically in the works of God or even in the New Testament with Jesus?
Like miracles?
Similar to miracles, but signs have a specific purpose.
To prove,
Okay?
well, like in the New Testament, to prove that Jesus was God.
Exactly. A sign in the difference between defining that and a miracle was, I am showing you something. I'm revealing this to you so that you might know that I'm God. Okay? So Jesus performs signs in order, we see this all throughout the Gospel of John. John writes specifically those words, signs, in order that it points to God's existence and power. So that's what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. I want to point out to all of you that this is a God who exists and he is mighty because of what he's doing. And then secondly, wonders. That which would produce surprise, astonishment, or admiration. Okay? That's what a wonder does. I mean, the quickest thought that I think of in looking at something that causes me to wonder is maybe looking at the vastness of the ocean, or a wonderful display of fireworks where you just have that natural thing to say, ooh or ah, you know. It's those fireworks that cause wonder, to say, oh, how magnificent those things are. It's something that would produce surprise, astonishment, or admiration. So this is the official response of Nebuchadnezzar to God concerning the event of his humbling. And he says, first and foremost, I want the nation, I want the empire of Babylon to know the signs and wonders of God that point to his existence and point to how mighty he is, point to his kingdom being an everlasting kingdom and his dominion that endures from generation to generation. Do you guys have any questions from verses 1 to 3 so far? Let me check our time real quick. I always get this messed up. I always stop it in the wrong way. Sorry. All right. Anybody? No questions? Okay, let's read verses 4 to 7.
I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of my dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation.
Okay. So he's saying, now I'm going to tell you the story. I'm going to bring the narrative so that it unfolds to you. Because obviously there was a need for the people to know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. They had 7 years of a time where like, where's the king? What happened to the emperor? He's just not around. We see his magistrates, we see his officials, but we don't see him. He's essentially kind of disappeared for the last 7 years. Well, Nebuchadnezzar says, from my own voice, from my own hand, I want to share with you what has happened. So verse 4, I was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. Those words, I was at ease in my house, means more than just, I was laying on the couch enjoying the weekend. I was ease at my house means that he had ceased from conquering. He was done conquering the nations, and it was a time of peace for the Babylonian Empire. Specifically at this time, he had finished the conquering of Egypt, okay? He'd finished the conquering of Egypt, and with his completed victories, he had ended his wars, and he made himself monarch of all those parts of the world, which was about the 34th or 35th year of his reign. In fact, the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel 29, why don't you guys turn there? Ezekiel 29, just one book previous, Ezekiel 29, verse 17 to 21. Somebody read that for me.
In the 27th year, in the first month, on the first day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, drove his army in a hard campaign against Tyre. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep, Tyre, yeah.
Every head was rubbed bare and every shoulder made raw, yet he and his army got no reward from the campaign he led against Tyre. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am going to give Egypt to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will carry off its wealth. He will loot and plunder the land as pay for his army. I have given him Egypt as a reward for his efforts, because he and his army did it for me, declares the sovereign Lord. On that day I will make a horn grow for the house of Israel. I will open your mouth among them, and they will know that I am the Lord.
Do you see what Ezekiel is saying there as a prophet? He's saying Nebuchadnezzar is used as an instrument of God against Egypt so that he might grow in prominence, okay? So it's amazing for me to see this because we know Nebuchadnezzar as a man of great arrogance and great cruelty, right? A man who is a wonderful military strategist, a wonderful campaigner of wars, and here he is thinking, I'm going to conquer these nations. All of that I do is because all of the success and fulfillments of what has happened in my life is because of what I have done. But here's the prophet Ezekiel saying, you know what? Beyond the veil, outside of time and space, it goes back to sovereign God. Sovereign God is moving you, Nebuchadnezzar, moving the Babylonian Empire into a place that he wants you to move in, thus securing the plan that he has for Daniel and for the rest of the nation of Israel. So that's what happens. He has secured Egypt, and now he's resting at ease in his palace. So he has the dream after and was accomplished. 7 years his distraction continued, and upon his recovery from which he penned this declaration, he lived about 2 years after and died in his 45th year. So basically, if you're looking at the time frame, he's at ease in his bed. He has this dream. It's interpreted before him. A year later, he falls into the fulfillment of that dream, and then for 7 years, he is in fact insane. He comes out of his insanity and lives for another 2 years, writes this letter, and then dies, okay? So it's mentioned just kind of historically that he underwent a long fatigue in his wars. He had made many tedious and dangerous campaigns in the field. But now at length here, at least at this moment in chapter 4, he's at rest in his house, and there's no adversary and there's no evil, okay? But this is the Lord's plan. This is what he's working out here. So we come then to, here he is, he has this dream, and I like how it kind of says in verse 5, he lays in his bed and the fancies and the visions of his head alarms him. And so then verse 7, he calls the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers to come in, and he tells them the dream, but they could not make known its interpretation. And of course he says it from a first-hand account. I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. It makes you start to wonder, what good are these guys? So far, they haven't done anything. And it's the Lord that is ultimately orchestrating this. Okay? So, any questions? Okay, let's jump forward to verses 8 and 9, because this is a pretty big chapter. Verse 8 and 9.
But alas, Daniel came before me. His name is Belshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. And I told the dream before, saying, Belshazzar, chief of the magicians, before I know that the spirit of the holy God is in you, and no secret troubles you, explains to me the visions of my dream that I have seen in its interpretation.
Okay, so here he says, here's Daniel. He's the chief of the magicians. And he says, I named him Belshazzar because of the spirit of the holy gods was in him. Now, the Hebrew interpretation of this is a little bit difficult because what we're doing is we're translating Aramaic to Hebrew and then Hebrew to English, right? And so it makes it somewhat difficult for us to see exactly what Nebuchadnezzar is saying here, especially concerning the term there, holy gods, or plural. It could be that he's using it as a word speaking singularly, but of course in the translation of the text here, we have that he's speaking plurally. So you can tell he's in this manner of this back and forth of him really knowing, okay, I've seen the events that God has orchestrated. I've seen the God of Daniel prove himself faithful. I've seen him do some wonderful things that cause me to worship him. But then again, on the side, there's these deities because it's part of my culture. It's part of my upbringing. My name points to these pagan gods itself, just like my father's name. So we see this contention kind of happening spiritually within the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Whether we see him ultimately put away those gods and follow the one true God is not exactly clear, but that's at least what we see there in verse 8 and 9. So here we are at verse 10 through 12. The visions of my head as I lay in my bed were these. I saw and beheld a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was very great. And the tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. And the beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Okay, so he has this dream. Have you ever had a dream that was just so clear to you that you could, sit down at breakfast with your family and say, I had this dream, and I'm just laying this description of what happened, I was flying or I don't know what you guys have had dreams before, but it was so real, it was so visual that you could just start naming the features of what happened and the experience of what happened. Well, this is exactly what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's important for us at least to take a look at this dream and kind of lay out the structure of what he was seeing here. If you guys don't mind, I'm going to move this chair real quick. Great. Well, so what's the first thing that he sees? In the visions of his head as he lays in his bed, he sees a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was very great. So the first thing he sees is what? Very, very basic. He sees a tree, right? He sees a tree. Good. No, it's okay. No trick questions are going to happen, okay? And so let's lay out the features of the tree. The first thing that we discover what? Is that it's in the midst of the earth, right? It's the midst of the earth. All right? That's the first thing we see. So if you can kind of picture it, as if he's looking at this tree, he sees, here's the earth, and here standing on the earth is this amazing tree, okay? That's what he's looking at, and it's a tree that encompasses in the midst of the earth there, all right? And what's the second feature? What do you think would be the second feature he sees there about it? The leaves. Mm-hmm.
It's height.
Its height. Its height was very great. Right. Good. Height was great. Giving the understanding that's higher than any other tree. Okay. It's taller than any tree. What's the second? Or the third feature? Excuse me.
Large and strong, and the top touched the sky.
Right. It's growing. It grew in strength, became strong. To the point that what? Just like you were saying,
Visible to the end of the earth.
to the ends of the whole earth, visible to the ends of the whole earth, right? Okay. Now to the features of the actual tree, what you were saying, Chris, verse 12.
Oh, it's leaves.
It's leaves. Were what? Sorry. Lovely, yeah. The leaves were just lovely. It's a word that's always interesting. I lived in England for 4 years, and you could see these just rough and tumble, like garbage men, and they would just, oh, it's just lovely. You know, they would use that word all the time. And it was just funny to me for a while, thinking, who uses that word lovely? He's going to say it all the time. The leaves were lovely, and then what else? It had fruit, right? Fruit was abundant. Fruit was abundant. And it produced food for all. Food for everybody. And then, of course, lastly, as a result of that, all flesh, birds of the heavens, and all flesh fed from it. Okay, so just from the outset, if you were to be a dream interpreter, what would you say the tree symbolized? Life. Okay. Yep. Anybody? Looking at all the features, it grew and became strong.
Oh, his kingdom.
Were visible to the whole earth. Leaves were lovely. Fruit was abundant. Fruit from everybody. All flesh fed from it. What's that? A prospering nation. His kingdom. Right. Yeah. It points to his empire. You guys are all passed the test. You're all dream interpreters now. Midst of the earth, height was great, grew, became very strong. He is the one that provides for all nations, right? And so that is the focus of the tree. So then, of course, do you guys have these? Can I?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just take that off real quick. Because then, what else do we have in the dream? We have the beasts and the birds, right? So we have the beasts and birds under the tree, and they find shade and they dwell in the branches, right? They find shade, they eat from the tree, and they dwell in the branches. Dwell in the branches. So just as he would be the kingdom, what would be the beasts and the birds?
His people who are subject.
Exactly. All the rest of the nations. So we see kind of like, if you can visually picture this in your mind, we have beasts and birds of all different types. You know, we have eagles, we have macaws, we have, you know, parrots, we have lions and tigers and bears, we have cows and herbivores, carnivores, and they're all just resting under the magnificence of this tree, and the tree provides everything that they need, okay? They find shade, they eat from the tree, and they dwell in the branches. That's a really bad looking dwell, but that's what it is, dwell. Looks like it says few on there. So, Nebuchadnezzar being alarmed by this dream at the same time is interesting because he would know the symbolism of what a tree is in dreams and what it symbolized in pagan culture. In fact, in Babylonian and Assyrian folklore, trees were often represented in nature as being the relationship of ground, sky, animals, and the netherworld. Ultimately kind of saying they were the connection between, you know, the temporary view of this life into eternity. And so, especially speaking of Nebuchadnezzar, I think he would have at least some insight to say, okay, this tree means what we just discovered ourselves, means my empire, The beasts and the birds, they find shade, they dwell on the branches. That must mean the surrounding empires, or excuse me, the surrounding kingdoms that I have conquered, okay? So even if you take a look at, and this is, I'd like you to do this on the side at some point. So look at Ezekiel chapter 31 at some point. Just write that down. Ezekiel chapter 31 and read that, because that also talks about tree in a symbolic manner. And then also there's other scriptural references of trees representing great men and princes, men who were kings over kingdoms. Ezekiel 17, 5 and 6. Ezekiel 31, verse 3, like you'll see in that chapter. Jeremiah, the prophet, chapter 22, verse 15, and then we have some Psalms. Psalms 1 through 3, we know that one, right? Right? He shall be like a tree planted by rivers of water, right? Okay. And then also 37, verse 35. So those are good to know. Ezekiel 17, 5 and 6, Ezekiel 31, verse 3, Jeremiah 22, that's a 2, verse 15, and Psalm chapter 1, verse 3, and 37 through 35. So it means something. It holds a symbolic nature to it, speaking of his empire, right? And it's over across the whole earth. So that's what we derive from verse 10 through 12 about what it is and what it means. So let's read verses 13 to 18.
In the visions I saw while lying in my bed, I looked, and there before me was a messenger, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and trim off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the animals flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. But let the stump and its roots, bound with iron and bronze, remain in the ground, in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of an animal, till 7 times pass by for him. The decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, that the living may know that the Most High is the sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and gives them to anyone he wishes, and sets over them the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, had. Now, Belshazzar, tell me what it means, for none of the wise men in my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you can, because the Spirit of the Holy God is in me."
So what do we have coming on the scene? We have somebody coming in on the scene, and the only thing that Nebuchadnezzar can assume is he calls it a holy one or a watcher, okay? Naturally, we would kind of see them as an angel, right? And this angel comes, and what does he command? Do you guys see that in the scriptures? Chop down the tree. Right, exactly. Chop down the tree so that it remains a stump. I want you to cut off the leaves. I want you to cut off the branches, scattering the leaves so that all the beasts and all the birds fly out, and they're no longer under the protection and the providence of this tree, so that it's left essentially as a stump, okay? So there's the stump, right? So, dream interpreters, what would you think the stump represents then? Cutting it down and leaving the stump there.
Well, don't remove Nebuchadnezzar completely. Just give him his bare. Just leave him barely alive.
Yeah, exactly. It would be one thing if he says chop down the tree and leave the stump. It would be a whole other thing if he said what? Pull him out of the roots, right? So what happens when you pull a stump completely or a tree out of its roots? It's a guarantee that it's going to die. Whereas we see a stump, we can see, oh, there's possibilities of life. If you've ever walked in a forest before, and you start to see what? You start to see growth coming out, right, of the stump, giving an idea that, oh, that stump is still alive. It's going to start growing again. So here's this angel. He shows up and it says he proclaims, or he cries aloud. Literally, he cries out with strength, a proclamation of power. And he says, chop down the tree, lop off all of its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit, let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Basically, he's saying remove any possibility that these birds and animals can receive benefit from this tree. However, leave the stump. And just like we interpreted or understood, that the stump gives occasion that there's life still in the tree, not taken from its roots, and therefore there's more potential for the life to be restored. Okay? So there's another thing, though, that the angel says that we need to do. What does he say? Can you see there in the text? Try and find it. It's in verse 23. What do we do with the stump?
Let it be wet with dew of heaven, and let him
Mm-hmm.
beasts of the earth till 7 times pass over him.
It does say that right before that. Look at the text.
Bound with the band of iron.
There you go. Bind the stump with a band of iron and bronze. So it's if he's saying, I want you to put a cap over this band, over this stump. And of course, we remember that iron and bronze are considered to be very strong metals, right? Iron and bronze, very strong metals. Often used to make weapons, but they were metals used as being very strong materially. So he's putting this cap on the stump there, representing a means of preservation to prevent the stump from actually dying on its own. It's as if to show in application God's promise is in a way that we'll see in the interpretation. Listen, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to cut you down, but I'm not going to obliterate you. I'm going to cut you down as a mercy to you rather than as just a straight punishment. I'm doing this in a way to say not only, and this goes back to what we were looking at in chapter 4, God's sovereignty means he's intolerant to sin, but he also shows mercy. Okay? This is what he's doing. This is what he's doing with Nebuchadnezzar. He's intolerant to sin, but he's also going to show mercy to Nebuchadnezzar. It's as if I'm going to put you through a trial, Nebuchadnezzar. I'm going to put you through an ordeal of discipline, of punishment, so that you might humble yourself and come to understand that I am sovereign God. Okay? And there's the emphasis. Where is it there? I'm losing my text. Yeah, verse 15, where it says, leave the stump in its roots, bind it with iron and bronze, let its portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Verse 16, let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know, and that's the emphasis. Here's the emphasis that we need to know. Verse 17, that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills and sets over it the lowliest of men. That should be an automatic light bulb in your ear, verse 17, to say that's God's sovereignty. I mean, if you write in your Bibles, I mean, that's such a blatant statement of God's sovereignty there in verse 17 of chapter 4. I'm sorry, that's why you guys couldn't find it, because I was looking at verse 23 and not of the others. Sorry, that was confusing about the iron and bronze. Verse 17, so that the living may know, that's the emphasis of the whole chapter, the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills and sets over the lowliest of men. So that is going to be definitely a key phrase in Daniel for you guys to know, possibly for your midterm. Okay? All right? This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw, verse 18, and you, O Belteshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Okay? So he says his mind is going to be changed. And he's going to be turned essentially from a beast into a man. Look at verse 16. His mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast mind be given to him. Okay? Interpreters, they looked at this text, translators of the Bible, and they're saying, okay, if there's an actual illness that might be connected to this, a mental illness that affects people, what is it that gives them the thought that they might turn from a man into a beast? And it identifies the condition similar to this, calling it the condition of what they say lycanthropy. You guys ever heard of lycanthropy before? In a very goofy way, in a very exotic way, people say that's what werewolfism is, is lycanthropy. But there is an actual depressive illness that is a very real thing, where a patient thinks of himself as a beast, snarl and scratch and act like an animal. And so that's what essentially is the destiny for Nebuchadnezzar, so that the Lord might be shown as the Most High, ruling over the kings and kingdoms of men for a period of 7 times. 7 periods of time pass over in verse 16, meaning which is very naturally 7 years, okay? So this is the purpose, the end, that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he wills, sets it over with the lowliest of men. So this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. He is essentially being obedient to God because of his command there in verse 17. The reason we have this chapter 4 recorded is because Nebuchadnezzar is saying, all right, Lord, I'm going to be faithful to what you're telling me to do, to let every empire, nation know that you are sovereign and you have control over the kingdoms of men. I don't have control as the emperor of all these nations, as the emperor of the Babylonian Empire. I don't have control. Ultimately, you have control, and you move us in the way that you want to move us in your timing and in your plan. So with that being said, let's take our break. Does anybody have any questions up to this point in the narrative, or even really up to the point that we are in Daniel? Is there anything previous to, like in past chapters, that was like, oh, I thought about this?
Well,
Yeah.
Kind of, sort of. Okay, so I was reading the Be Resolute book.
Uh-huh.
When it was the first chapter.
Uh-huh.
It was kind of, I guess, a question on what you think, because I was always taught, when Daniel and his 3 friends, when they were being in that complete assimilated
Yeah.
process,
Yeah.
that in order for them to become eunuchs, they had to become castrated.
Right.
Okay, but I was always taught that they were castrated, but in the Be Resolute book, it said that they probably weren't.
Right.
Just because that term eunuch was transferred over to those of high position.
Right.
So I guess which one makes more sense to you?
Well,
Because I know it wouldn't defile the bodies by eating the king's food.
it would defile. You're right.
So that makes sense that they wouldn't defile the bodies that
Right.
way.
Right. And
I don't know how that would work.
in connection to that, where it has Ashpenaz, is that correct? In the first chapter, being the chief over the eunuchs.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't mean that he was solely the chief over the eunuchs. That was just his large title.
Okay.
Meaning that usually those men that actually, as far as blunt that we're getting with being castration, the men that were actually castrated to be eunuchs usually dealt within the harem of Nebuchadnezzar, so that there would be no real temptation of intermingling,
Okay. But
things of that
they would be
nature.
like the wise men, they didn't need to.
No, I don't think that's I don't think that ultimately happened with Daniel and the rest of the company. But it's important to think about that too, because again, it comes back to that choice. I will not choose to defile myself in this way, and I think the Lord, in His providence and in His sovereignty, Just like it says at the beginning of Daniel, where it says the Lord gave compassion to Daniel, and Ashpenaz and the chief of the eunuchs. Really had compassion on them. So I think there's some mercy involved as well with that. So, cool.
Yeah, that was about it.
Yeah. Anybody else? No?
Good, yeah.
Okay. Let's come back at 3:15-ish at the latest. Okay. Let's start with verses 19 through 22. I'll read that. Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. And the king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. And Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and which food for all, under which beasts of the field found shade, in whose branches the birds of the heavens lived. 22, it is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the end of the earth. First thing that we just need to draw attention to is that of the character of Daniel. Notice there in the section, it's sharing with him that he's upset about having to share this interpretation. Do you notice that? It says he was dismayed. Does somebody have another word in another translation? Astonished. Yeah. He was dismayed for a while. It almost shows a rooted relationship. It shows a rooted relationship between Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar. There was a rapport that kind of came between them, especially Daniel being in the midst of the king's business. He's the chief magician over all the other magicians. Daniel's whole job was to attend to the service of the king. And so ultimately, he's disturbed by the interpretation. He holds Nebuchadnezzar highly in high respect. And the interpretation at that point sounds good so far, right? Here's the tree in all of its splendor and all of its majesty. It's this wonderful, gorgeous tree that produces fruit for all these plants and animals. It reaches to the heavens. It's grown in strength. It is you, Nebuchadnezzar. All right, that sounds really great. Yeah, that's good so far. Let's just end the interpretation there, right? But of course, we then get the occasion of the Watcher, the Holy One. So verse 23 to 27. Let's go back now through this way. So I'll have Chris do it. Back around.
23, 27.
Mm-hmm.
And inasmuch as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, Chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and the roots in the earth, bound with a band of bronze, iron and bronze, and in the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him gaze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. They shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives to whomever he chooses. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of prosperity, of your prosperity.
All right, so what we have is 5 things that happen, right? That's going to happen to Nebuchadnezzar. Number 1, he's going to be driven from men. Driven from men. And what does that mean? It connects back to that verse of, I think it's 16, where he will lose the mind of man. So it's basically his reasoning will be gone. Will be gone. Meaning he's just basically going to go insane. Insane. Okay? Driven from men. Your dwelling shall be with beasts. So, dwell with beasts. That means basically he's going to leave the palace and just spend all of the days of his 7 years amidst other animals and eating the grass like other animals. So he's going to live outside. Being which, of course, we have number 3, and the dew of heaven will wet you. You shall be wet with dew. So can you kind of imagine this just for a second? A king who goes crazy. Well, before I get into this illustration, we'll finish this real quick. 7 times or 7 periods will pass over you, okay? That word period in the Aramaic is the word idadin, I-D-D-A-D-I-N. And it basically means a period of seasons, so the 4 seasons, right? So essentially this is going to mean 7 years. All right? And then it says, your kingdom, number 5, will be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. All right? Your kingdom will be assured. That comes back now to the mercy of God, meaning that this kingdom, your kingdom will be assured.
What is that? Number 4, 7, or the
7 periods. I-D-A-D-I-N is the literal word for period in Aramaic. And that means period of seasons. Your kingdom will be assured, meaning your kingdom will still be in place. It'll be taken care of for you. It'll be protected because of the fact that you will come out of this repenting before the Lord and know basically what it says there in verse 26, so that you know that heaven rules. And there's something, verse 26 is unique to Scripture. This is something that's good, unique to the Old Testament. And it's because of that heaven rules. Heaven rules. Because of the fact that this is the only time that heaven, the word heaven, is used as like a title of God himself. So you might know that heaven rules, okay? Not in the sense, of course, that heaven rules like heaven's cool, but heaven actually has dominance over your kingdom, all right? And what's wonderful about all of this, I mean, all of this is really negative, isn't it? You're going to go insane for 7 years. You're going to live outside with the rest of the beasts. You're going to chew the grass. And for that long period of time, you're just going to be not a king. And you can kind of picture that. And this becomes the illustration. I mean, like, visualize it in your mind. You know, a man who is decrepit, or it says his fingernails. Where does it say that? Let's see that in the text. Where is that? Yeah, verse 25. To eat grass like an ox, you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time shall pass over you. I am losing it. Where is it? Immediately the word. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. His hair grew long. Thank you. His hair grew long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. You're gonna look gnarly. You're gonna look as if you are a crazy man who is unkept, and you kind of could just. Like, I picture it, at least in my mind, you know, this insane man in the grass, in the meadow, just moving around. And you can kind of see off in the distance some soldiers that are just like the only job that they have is like, we're just going to watch this guy for 7 years, make sure he doesn't hurt himself, because he is the king and we just don't want him to go insane, while the kingdom is in the background, just living as it is without a king. And this is prophesied to him. And this is the real emphasis, too, on the mercy of God. Look at verse 27 there. And here's a big emphasis that I want you guys to know. Verse 27, this vision of the future vision of the future was, here's the conditional. Whoop, conditional. Do you see that? Daniel is saying, Nebuchadnezzar, repent now. Let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. So it's as if God is saying, in such a clear way, Nebuchadnezzar, turn back to God, or turn to God. Remove your pagan deities, follow me, acknowledge that I am sovereign over your kingdom. You are not all that you think you are. You are not the one who deserves all of the praise, all of the success. Worship me, and your prosperity will be lengthened. There's a possibility of you not having to go through this 7 years of humbling from God himself. He could repent, and the Lord would be merciful. And this is, of course, this does not happen, as we see in the text, verse 28 to 33. Do you want to read that? Verse 28 to 33.
And this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom like men, and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew long as eagle's feathers, and his nails swelled towards the top.
Okay. So, that interpretation actually does come to place. So it's a year, though, after the interpretation of the dream. Nebuchadnezzar's pride causes his downfall. It's interesting, a lot of things can happen in a year, right? I'm sure there's the possibility of his time of being penitent before the Lord, and this dream is well on his mind, but as time goes on, of course, what happens? We start to forget our dreams. We start to forget the promises of the Lord, both negative and positive, and we start to live our life more in the direction of how we would want to live and not how God wants us to live. And notice the arrogance there in verse 30. The king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon? And look at the personal words there, which I have built, my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty, right? It's all me, 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 me. I'm exclaiming the praise and power of who I am and what I have done. And while the words were still in his mouth, can you believe that? The words were still in his mouth, verse 31, he hears the voice from heaven saying, I told you, didn't I tell you? Don't you know? I warned you this was happening, and now I am going to fulfill my promise. And it's interesting about this kingdom. I've built my mighty power. I've built my majesty. When they've done archaeological excavations of the Babylonian Empire, the majority of the bricks that they found, each brick was stamped with the name of Nebuchadnezzar. It's as if to say, okay, this brick here, that's my brick. And that's my brick. And look at all the bricks that compose this entire kingdom. All of these bricks, they belong to me. They're mine. It's such a thing of arrogance to say that, But it is, in some ways, in the mind of a pagan, totally true. This is the kingdom that I have built. I deserve the praise and the honor. Yet, it is God's mercy in his sovereignty to say, I'm going to not be tolerant of your sin, Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to do something to you that's going to humble you and turn your perspective off of yourself into the direction of me, okay? So, just like the pharaohs, there's no historical record of anything negative happening with Nebuchadnezzar. You guys, you've heard that before, right? With pharaohs before, or with emperors of the past. When they have their scribes, when they have their writers, I want you to write my biography of all the things that I've done, but I want you to leave out this, 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 and this, because of the fact I don't want any negative to come upon me. So they have not found Babylonian records of this happening to Nebuchadnezzar. But what we have found is other cultures, other nations' records that point into that direction. For instance, let me write the name down so you guys know. Helps to spray this thing. Okay. There's a Greek historian named Abydinus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not. He was a Greek historian. I'm just going to put G-R-K, historian. And he wrote in the year 268, wrote 268 BC about Nebuchadnezzar. So this would essentially be a couple of centuries later, right? About 200 years after Nebuchadnezzar. But he wrote that in the historical, in his historical writings, that Nebuchadnezzar, for a time, I'm just going to put Neb, period, was possessed by a deity. By a deity, okay? And that he disappeared for a time.
You said that's 268 or
268, yeah. 268. Disappeared for a time. And so that kind of substantiates what's being written here in Scripture. And another thing that substantiates it as well is that they have found Babylonian records of history that has happened. But what's interesting is that they still have not found any government activity. There is no written government activity from the years 582 to 575 BC. Okay? So basically they're like, nothing's happening. It's a time of peace. There was nothing really going on. But that at least speculates this might have been the time that Nebuchadnezzar fell into that crazy insanity and then had to be watched as an animal for 7 years. Okay? So that's 582 to 575 BC. Abydinus, Greek historian, wrote in 268 BC, Nebuchadnezzar was possessed by a deity, disappeared for a time. Okay? Okay? So let's come to a close, and we'll finish. Who wants to read verse 34 to 37? Anybody? Okay, great.
All they have is 35.
32, is that right? 34. 34 to 37.
And at the end of time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to the heaven, and my understanding returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of the kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles restored it to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down.
So what we're reading there in that conclusion is really the last words of Nebuchadnezzar understood in Daniel. And that's pretty powerful, isn't it? To have the last words recorded from any one person to say, you know what? I am the emperor over the entire known world, and I am humbled because God is sovereign. I am humbled because of the blessed Most High who lives forever, because his dominion is everlasting. And because his dominion is everlasting, my dominion is not everlasting. His kingdom endures from generation to generation, mine doesn't. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven. So all of the qualities that Nebuchadnezzar first mentions about himself that we've discovered from really chapter 1 of Daniel all the way to this point now are transitioned to the perspective of God. His dominion, his kingdom, his qualities, those are unmatched among any other Babylonian pagan deity of his own character, and the roles have been reverted to its correct form. God is on the throne, and Nebuchadnezzar is not. So the last words of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel represent the last words, I think, speak to a little bit towards his belief. So it's, of course, speculation, but we can always ask ourselves, maybe there's a possibility that we might meet Nebuchadnezzar in heaven. I mean, that would be a pretty amazing thing to think about. Of course, it's always back to our own speculation about that. John Calvin has written in his commentary that he doesn't think so. And there's other historians that do think so. So it's interesting nonetheless. But all that to say, chapter 4, an awesome testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar from his own lips proclaiming the goodness of God and the humility that he experienced in living. So what we're going to discover, of course, is next week is we have Belteshazzar, which Belshazzar, if I'm remembering correctly, is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. His son had a fairly short time reigning. And we see in chapter 5 the overthrow of the Babylonian Empire to now the Medo-Persian Empire that we see from Daniel chapter 2, the next empire to take over. So it's that really, again, man, Daniel has a lot of Sunday school stories. Daniel chapter 5 being the handwriting on the wall, right? The mene tekel upharsin. You've been weighed, measured, and found wanting. So that will be a good time. And then hopefully we might be able to end a little bit early in that class next week and then kind of go over what will be expected of you in your midterm in 2 weeks after that week. Okay?